and because their sin is very grievous. I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come to me. And if not, I will know. Well, we don't know what's happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, but we know that God's got wind of it and that that's not good. And we know that sin means to miss the mark. And so we know that whatever has happened in Sodom and Gomorrah means that something about the natural ethical order of things has been seriously violated. And there's a strong intimation in the Old Testament, which I think, by the way, is completely correct, that if the proper order of being is violated, and that's something like the balance between chaos and order, say, if the proper balance of being is violated, then all hell will break loose. And one of the things I can tell you from reading a very comprehensive set of myths from around the world is that that's a conclusion that human beings have come to everywhere. Stay on the goddamn path and be careful. Because if you start to mess around and you deviate, especially if you know that you're deviating, things are not going to go well for you. And that idea is everywhere. And I think it's right. I think the idea is right because there aren't that many ways of doing things right, and there's a lot of ways of doing things wrong. And if you do things wrong, the consequences of doing them wrong can be truly catastrophic. You know, one of the things I learned from reading Viktor Frankl first, but then Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I think did a deeper job, was that, and Václav Havel thought the same thing, that these people were very much trying to understand what happened in places like Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is a particularly good analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union. And his conclusion, and it's a 2,100 page conclusion, and it's like hammered home with a hammer. It's a book that everyone should read. You know, assuming that you can read a 2,100 page scream, because that's basically what it is. You know, first of all, what he does is document just how terrible things were in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. And no matter how terrible you think they were, unless you know the stories, they were a lot more terrible than that. And they were terrible personally, because everyone lied. They were terrible in families, because 2 out of 5 people were government informers. They were terrible among friends because no one could tell each other the truth. They were terrible socially because the whole system was corrupt and ran on slave labor. And they were terrible philosophically because the doctrine of man upon which the state was founded was hopeless and nihilistic. And they were murderous, destructive, and genocidal. It's like they got it wrong at every single level of analysis simultaneously. And the question is, why? And Solzhenitsyn's answer, and to some degree Viktor Frankl's answer as well, and Václav Havel, and I would say also Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, they all ended up in the same conceptual sphere. And the answer was because individual people lived crooked lives. Because individual people swallowed lies and spoke them and didn't stand up for the truth. And the corruption that spread from each individual pulled the entire state mechanism into that corruption and made everything into hell. You know, there are other theories. Obedience, right? That's kind of the Milgram idea from that it's easy to make human beings obedient to people in authority. And I've explored that idea quite a bit with regards to what happened, for example, in the Nazi concentration camps. And yes, you can set circumstances up so that people are likely to be obedient to orders that are pathological. There's no doubt about that. And yes, sometimes that's indicative of the weakness of their character, but that's not the issue. And the idea that what happened in Nazi Germany was because a population of good people listened to a tiny minority of bad people, that's really not a good theory. The Nazi ethos was there at every single level of the social organization, right? Right from the familial, all the way up to the leadership. It was the same thing all the way up and all the way down. And the same thing in the Soviet Union. And so, if you miss the mark, which is apparently what the people of Sodom and Gomorrah did, their sin was grievous, then they risked destruction. And I just cannot see how, after the 20th century, anybody with any sense could possibly not see that as true. And I think that there's a line in the Old Testament, you know, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I can tell you one of the things that frightened me badly was the realization from reading Solzhenitsyn and a variety of other things that I was reading at the same time, that Dostoevsky as well, because he makes the same point. He said that a human being is not only responsible for everything they do, but for everything that everyone else does. Now, you know, that's crazy, and he was an epileptic and a mystic, and that's a crazy thing to say. But it's also, there's something about it that's true, because if you were better, the people around you would be less worse than they are. And if you were good enough, you don't know how much better the people around you would be. And so, there's this idea too, you know, that Christ took the sins of the world unto himself. That's a complicated idea, man. I wrestled with that one for a very long time, but I think I figured out at least in part what it means. It meant that it's something like the realization of complete humanity. You see, to take the sins of the world unto yourself is to realize that, is to understand the Nazi concentration camp guard. Because that person is human, and so are you. And so if you can't see you in that, then you don't know who you are. And if you can see you in that, well, then you've started to take the sins of the world onto yourself, because you've actually started to take responsibility for those terrible things. You know, I think it's the motif of the motto of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We must never forget. That's close. And I think, well, you can't forget. You can't remember what you don't understand. You will forget what you don't understand. And the question is, well, what are you supposed to remember about the Holocaust? It was a historical event, that 6 million people died. That's not what's to remember. What's to remember is that's what people can do. And you're one of them. And if you don't understand that you could do that, then you don't know who you are. So God's making a case here. He's making a case that people of Sodom and Gomorrah have sinned, and it's making a large racket that even God has heard about. That's a very common mythological motif, by the way, that the sins and what would you call it? The sins and noise of humanity can reach such a clamor that even the gods hear and are forced to intervene. That comes all the way from the Mesopotamian creation story. So anyways, it's logical. Yeah, they're sinning. Okay, well, so what? Well, no, not so what. It means that God's offended and that everything is at risk. That's what it means. It's like that's something worth taking seriously. And the men turned their faces from thence and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And Abraham drew near and said, Will thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? This is a very interesting part of the story. A friend of mine took me to task the other day when I was writing about portraying the Old Testament God as pretty harsh and judgmental, and the New Testament God is sort of all loving, which he isn't, because there's the whole book of Revelations thing. But I got that partly from reading Northrop Frye. But going through the Old Testament in more detail, I realized that is a too low resolution interpretation, and that God, who's dispensing a fair bit of harsh justice in the Old Testament, is also someone who can be negotiated with, weirdly enough. And that's what happens here. You know, Abraham has just been told that whatever's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah is seriously not good, and that God's going to do something about it. And he takes it upon himself, this is an act of mercy, to ask God to be a bit more judicious, right? It's like, okay, you're going to wipe out the city. Well, bad things are happening there, but you know, there's probably a few people in the damn city that aren't completely corrupted by what's going on there. Of course, that's an open question, you know, because it's an open question. For example, how many people there were in Nazi Germany who weren't completely corrupted by what was going on in Nazi Germany? And the same thing could be said about Maoist China, and the same thing could be said about the Soviet Union. It's like, well, perhaps there was a person somewhere who didn't understand at some level what was happening, but, you know, the whole issue of willful blindness certainly springs to mind, if nothing else. Anyways, Abraham decides to intercede with God on behalf of these people who are going to be destroyed. He says, will thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Perhaps there be 50 righteous people within the city. Will you also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are there? That be far from thee to do after this manner. He's kind of reminding God that he's a good guy, as far as I can tell. To slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Should not the judge of the earth do right? And the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 right, he seems a bit taken aback here to me. If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, behold, now I have taken upon me to speak upon the Lord, unto the Lord, but I am but dust and ashes. Possibly there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And God said, if I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And Abraham spoke unto him yet again and said, he's kind of sneaking up on God here. Peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for 40's sake. And he said unto him, oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak. Possibly there shall be 30 found there. And God said, I won't do it if I find 30 there. And Abraham, who seems really to be pushing his luck by this point, says, behold, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Possibly there shall be 20 found there. And God said, I won't destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak yet, but this once. Perhaps 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way, and as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. Well, there's 2 ways you can read that part of the story. One is that, 3, let's say, you can bargain with God, even if you're kind of annoying about it, so that's kind of interesting. And the second is that even if there's a minority of good in a place that isn't good, it won't be slated for destruction. That's kind of a good thing. And the third is, a minority of good in a place can keep it from being destroyed. And that's a really good thing too, and I believe that as well. I think that good is more powerful than evil. Naivety isn't, but I think that good is. And I think that in a place that's corrupt, a minority of people who stand forth against the corruption can prevail. Now, you know, I think one of the best examples of that, again, was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, because he was in the terrible work camps when he wrote his book. He memorized most of it, which is not an easy thing to do when it's 2,100 pages long and set in very tiny font. And he memorized most of it, and then he wrote it. And it was one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union. You know, it was published in the 1970s, first of all in the West. And the first thing that happened, at least initially, was that the communism as an ethical system lost absolutely all credibility whatsoever among anyone who is even vaguely educated immediately upon the publication of the Gulag Archipelago. He pulled the moral slats out from underneath it. And the book was definitely one of the reasons, there were many, but was definitely one of the reasons why the rotten system crumbled and fell without a war. And that's a great example of how one person can take on a tyranny and prevail. So, and he's not the only person who did that sort of thing, because, well, Gandhi did the same thing. I mean, I don't think the English were the Russians, but, you know, things were not so good in India. And what Gandhi did in India, under the influence, by the way, of Leo Tolstoy, was also a remarkable example of a single person intervening in a catastrophe and setting it far more right than it could be. So, and there came 2 angels to Sodom at evening, and Lot, remember Lot is Abraham's nephew, sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, behold, my lords, I turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early and go on your ways. Now he's Abraham's nephew and kinsman, and acting in exactly the manner that Abraham does. He shows hospitality to these people. And they said, no, we'll stay in the street all night. And he insisted, he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him and entered into his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they did eat. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out to us, that we may know them. Well, that's the part of the story that's been used as a diatribe, let's say, against homosexuality, because to know is to engage in sexual intercourse, and the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were willing to tear the strangers out of Lot's house and use and abuse them as they saw fit, right? And so what are they doing? Well, they're violating the principles that govern appropriate conduct with the stranger. And maybe the stranger is something you shouldn't mess with, because you don't know who you're messing with. So that's like warning number one. Well, and they're violating the essential principles of hospitality. And then there's the sexual thing here, I think, isn't the sexual thing here is something more like the absolute danger of immediate gratification, sexual included, outside the constraints of any civilized structure whatsoever. Right, because that's as uncivilized behavior as you could possibly hope for, right? Strangers come into your city, they're in the house of someone who's part of your city, they're being shown hospitality, a mob shows up and says, fork them over, man. We're going to do whatever the hell we want to them, and it's not going to be good. And if you get in the way, things are going to go even worse for you. So that's what it seems to me to be. It's completely dysregulated behavior. It's behavior that's outside the confines of any civilized structure whatsoever. It's an indication that the social structure of the entire society has collapsed, so that there's nothing left for the inhabitants to do except to engage in the most brutal of immediate gratification and destruction. Well, so what does Lot do? I pray thee, brethren, do not do so wickedly. Behold now, I have 2 daughters which have not yet known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and you do to them as is good in your eyes, only unto these men do nothing. And therefore came thee under the shadow of my roof. Well, it's hard to know what to make of that, you know. I mean, it doesn't exactly seem like the advisable thing for Lot to do. But I think at least what it is an indication of the degree to which he took the solemn vow of hospitality seriously. And I think that's the idea that the story is trying to promote. And the angel said, stand back. Oh, and the men said, stand back. And they said again, this one fellow came into sojourn to talk to us, and he will needs be a judge. Now we'll deal worse with him than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Maybe what Lot thought was something like, well, we're done. Like, we're all done with this mob. And perhaps I can spare some of us. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. But the men, this is the angels, put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. So they were so corrupt that they were blind and could not see now, even to find the door. And the men then said unto Lot, hast thou here any family members, son-in-law, and thy sons and thy daughters, and whoever thou hast in this city, get them out of the place, for we will destroy this place, because of the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord hath sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, up, you get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the man laid hold upon his hands, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him. And they brought him forth, and